Have you ever had that feeling where your money just doesn't seem to go as far as it used to? You know, when the cost of groceries or gas or pretty much everything seems to be creeping up? Well, there's actually a tool that measures that exact feeling. It's called the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. So let's break down how this one number has such a huge impact on our economy, and yeah, our wallets. So what exactly is the CPI? Well, at its core, it's a measure of the overall cost of goods and services that a typical consumer buys. Honestly, the easiest way to picture it is like this. Imagine a giant national shopping basket, and it's filled with everything a normal family buys. The CPI, it's just the price tag on that entire basket. All right, so in this explainer, we're going to break it all down. We'll start with what the CPI really is, then we'll walk through how it's calculated. After that, we'll see how it turns into that inflation rate you always hear about on the news. We'll even compare it to another key metric, look at some of its flaws, because nothing's perfect, and finally, wrap up with why it is still so important. Okay, let's dive in. First up, what is the CPI? We're going to stick with our main idea here, the nation's shopping basket. And this really gets to the heart of why it matters so much. The CPI is our main tool for keeping an eye on the cost of living. So when you hear that the CPI is rising, what that really means is that a typical family has to spend more money just to maintain the exact same standard of living. It's a direct measure of your purchasing power. So how in the world do economists actually come up with this number? It might sound complicated, but it's not so bad. In this next part, we're going to walk through how we build the index together. It really just boils down to a pretty clear four-step process. First, you fix the basket. Second, you go out and find the prices for everything in it. Third, you add it all up and compute the total cost. And finally, you compute the index itself. See, it's a very systematic approach. So let's talk about step one, fix the basket. An agency, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US, literally surveys thousands of families to figure out what a typical consumer buys. This basket has everything. We're talking food, clothes, housing, transportation, you name it. They figure out the quantities of each thing to create this one big representative shopping list. Okay, so once the agency finds the current prices for every single item, that's step 2, and adds them all up to get the basket's total cost, that's step 3, we get to the final step, computing the index. And this formula is the key to everything. You take the price of the basket in the current year, divide it by the price of the same basket in a special base year, and then multiply by 100. That base year is our anchor, our starting point for all the comparisons. Now, you don't usually hear people on TV talking about the CPI number itself, right? What you hear about is inflation. So let's connect the dots between the index we just calculated and that big number that always dominates the headlines. It's actually super simple. The inflation rate is just the percentage change in the CPI from one period to the next, usually from 1 year to the next. So when the CPI number goes up, that change, when you put it in percentage terms, is the inflation rate. And the math for it is really straightforward. You just take the CPI from this year, subtract last year's CPI, divide that result by last year's CPI, and then multiply by 100 to get the percentage. And that's it. That's the inflation rate everyone's talking about. But you know, the CPI isn't the only game in town. There's another tool economists use to measure prices, called the GDP deflator. It's important to know the difference, because even though they both measure price changes, they do it in different ways. And sometimes they can tell us slightly different stories about the economy. Think of them as two different tools for two different jobs. Okay, so here's the main difference. The CPI tracks the prices of things that we as consumers buy, and that includes stuff we import from other countries. The GDP deflator, on the other hand, tracks the prices of things our country produces and only the stuff made here. And remember that fixed basket for the CPI? Well, the GDP deflator's basket is flexible. It changes as our country's production changes. So the CPI is a super powerful tool. But let's be real, it is not perfect. It's really important to get a balanced view and understand its limits. So let's take a look at the flaws in the index. Economists pretty much agree on two main problems that can cause the CPI to slightly overstate the true cost of living. The first is something called substitution bias, and the second is the introduction of new goods. Let's start with substitution bias. Just think about how you shop. If the price of apples suddenly skyrockets, what do? Well, you probably buy fewer apples and maybe grab some bananas instead. But remember,
The CPI is based on a fixed basket. It just assumes you keep buying the same amount of those now expensive apples. It doesn't fully capture that we cleverly switch from, say, pricey beef to cheaper chicken. And because of that, the index can sometimes overstate how much our cost of living has actually gone up.
And the second issue is new goods. I mean, think about it. When a totally new product, like the first smartphone, gets invented, it gives you way more choices. It makes every dollar you have more valuable because you can do more with your money. But because that CPI basket is fixed for a while, it doesn't immediately capture the incredible value that all this new variety and innovation brings into our lives.
So, after hearing about these flaws, you might be asking yourself, well, why do we rely on it so heavily then? That's a great question. So let's shift gears and talk about why the CPI, even with its imperfections, is still an absolutely essential tool for our economy. Probably one of the biggest reasons it matters so much is that the CPI has massive real-world consequences. A lot of government programs, like Social Security, for instance, use the CPI to make cost of living adjustments. This means the index directly affects the income of millions of people, helping to make sure their benefits keep pace with rising prices.
You know, in the end, it all comes back to its fundamental purpose, which this quote sums up perfectly. The CPI is, at its heart, a comparison tool. It shows us the cost of a specific basket of stuff today relative to the cost of that exact same basket way back in a benchmark base year. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? I think it's that the Consumer Price Index is an imperfect but truly essential economic snapshot. Yeah, it has its biases, for sure, but it gives us a vital, standardized way to track the cost of living and to adjust our economic policies to help people out.
And that leaves us with a really critical question for the future. Our lives are changing constantly, right? We buy new things, technology's always evolving, our tastes shift. So the big question we have to ask is, as our real-life shopping baskets continue to change, how do our economic tools, like the CPI, need to evolve right along with them to keep giving us an accurate picture of our world?